Let's get started and welcome our second speaker in the series this term, Dr. Viviane Gravey, who is joining us from Queen's University, Belfast. It's a real pleasure to welcome you. If I may do a small introduction, we work on quite similar topics, so I am very familiar with most, if not all, of your academic writing. You have several specialisms, including policy dismantling at the European Union level, as well as most high profile, I would say, in terms of the involvement with the wider academic community, but also the things that you're going to be talking about today is your work on Brexit and the environment. And that's what's drawn you here today. You're co-founder and co-chair of the Brexit Environment Network. And this has been something that's led you to being involved in giving feedback to various government level committees, as I understand it, as well as interviewing some of the most high influential policymakers in these areas. So we're looking forward to learning a lot from you today. Thank you so much for joining us, and it's over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to be sharing my screen. Currently I have my window open, but it looks like, as not very rare for Belfast, we may have a bit of a helicopter around. So if it gets too loud, sound, please let me know and I'll shut it down. So you should be now seeing my screen.
Not yet.
Nope, it hasn't worked, so I'm just going to do that again. You should now be seeing my screen. Yeah. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to be talking today about a kind of a side project for Brexit and the environment. So Brexit and Environment is a coalition of academics looking at the impact of Brexit on the environment. But with Nathalie Bernier, who's at Sciences Po Rennes, I've also been really interested in environmental NGOs during the referendum campaign. We started Brexit and Environment in 2015, and so we were trying to provide information on the environment during the campaign and failed miserably, I think, to make the environment matter during the campaign. And at the same time, it was interesting to see that we were not the only one failing and that NGOs were also really struggling to get their points across. So that's that was the original starting point of the paper. And that led me into a literature that I wasn't really familiar with, which is all literature on civil society organization and charities, and the fact that actually in the UK you have a very strong regulatory framework around charities that are quite limited in what they can do and how they can engage politically or not. And so the whole idea that you have to link any kind of action back to your charitable objectives. And so we're going to see how that's going to be quite a problem for environmental NGOs during a campaign. So charities ahead of the referendum, what they're facing is really this kind of major decision. Are they going to risk their own reputation and their own relationship with the government, but also with the general public who funds them in many ways by engaging in what is an extremely divisive campaign that is going to cut across society, but also their membership. So what's interesting is that actually the environmental sector is really an outlier in this. Most of the UK's environmental charity, most of the UK's charities in general, in the health, care, international development, poverty, all of these charities abstained. They did not participate, most of them, in the campaign, and yet quite a few of the environmental one did. So why was the environment, why it kind of failed in the end, because they engaged for Remain, yet they managed to mobilize in a way that other charities didn't. And so why they did so and how they managed to navigate that unique context is what we're going to be focusing on in this paper. And then because of course this is looking back at 2016, but what can we learn from this around difficulties of speaking for and about Europe, but also the difficulties for non-governmental groups to engage in UK politics as well. Okay, so quite a lot of things that I want to cover here. So in terms of context, looking back, we have to remember that the referendum comes after the coalition government, and that during the coalition government, you had this whole idea of, big society, but actually quite a crackdown on what charities can and cannot do. You have this idea of, a government minister saying charities should stick to their knitting, and not in a positive pro-knitting kind of way. And you have also this awkward timing in that the referendum is, we know there's going to be a referendum after the surprise Conservative win in May 2015, But actually that referendum is promised by the end of 2017. And it's actually moved up very, prominently, like almost like a year and a half before. So the referendum happens much quicker than a lot of groups think it would. And that really is problematic for many groups to get engaged. Now, what's problematic as well is that there's a time where NGOs are going to be called on to speak for Europe. Europe hasn't done so well on the environment, as Paul knows very well. So we've had a lot of issues here with the last two commission around that time, so the Juncker Commission and also the second commission of Barroso, that have been really, really bad on the environment, and actually, or if not outrightly bad, at least really unambitious and really treating the environment as something that is just really not central to the European ideal. And so this happens at the same time as we have, of course, Michael Gove in his Tired of Experts, but more generally what we're going to have is a very anti-expert campaign, and NGOs are groups that are really, that whole identity and lobbying is built on the fact that they talk about facts, that they're evidence-based, and that they come from a position of having engaged with the science. So it's really not a good kind of situation for them to engage. So the methods we've done is we've focused on a strategic choice of 6 ENGOs, so CPRE, the Campaign to Protect Rural England, the Wildlife Trust, the RSPB, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, and WWF UK. We did 12 interviews in 2017, and then analysis of media coverage. And for those of you who don't know about this as well, the LSE Library Referendum Archive is really good to see all the leaflets from the campaign for both 75 and 2016. It's a fantastic resource. And then we put all of that in NVivo and did some content analysis there. So the conceptual framework is quite simple, is that we are looking at both external pressure and internal pressure in driving these campaigning decisions. So basically we've got the external pressure that all of these charities are going to face, mediated by internal pressure. In these internal pressure, we've actually talked about capacity or competence in terms of their EU links as well, into how much did they get, like how much they knew about Europe, how much were their work already interlinked with Europe, but also the type of membership structure they have, which is quite different from these groups, from between the different groups. So we really focus on how staff and leaders within this organization were able to shape organizational responses to these pressures to decide on whether to campaign, to abstain, or to campaign for remain, what kind of wording, what kind of timing in their campaign choices. Our starting assumptions are basically that we expect charities not to go for it. The negative coverage in the press prior to the referendum, plus the very constraining regulatory environment, makes it very unlikely for charities to want to actually campaign. So it could be that only the NGOs that don't have a charitable status would go. We expect environmental NGOs that have actually sustained interaction with Europe, either because they receive EU funding or because they advocate, they lobby the EU, to be much more likely to be engaged because they'll know what is at risk. But again, they're not going to all behave the same way, because depending on the size of their membership, they may want to actually develop strategies that basically just focus about telling their members what to do. If they don't have many members, they're going to have to think about very different kind of strategies. And finally, in terms of speed, we think that policy teams in more centralized and UK-only organizations are going to be quicker to react and also more likely to campaign for Remain. So, our external pressures. So we're looking at constraining media and the regulatory context there. So the first one to consider is the Charity Commission. We've got long-standing regulatory constraints on what charities can and cannot do in the UK. Trustees are extremely important. Trustees have to verify a priori, so before the political campaigning, that political campaigning is only ever in furtherance of the primary charitable purpose. So here, save the environment. And even if relevant, to consider like the potential impact on public image. So trustees are really being told, be extremely careful. You don't want to be aligned with the political parties. Are you really sure you want to do this? And you want to let that organization do this? It's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to cost a lot of members. So the guidance published in early March 2016 is stricter even than the kind of what the sector assumed. So we're talking about you can only campaign in the referendum in exceptional circumstances. Any of that talking about the referendum will be political activity. Tweets by staff is going to be very problematic. You have to really control what your staff say publicly on social media, and you have to really be aware of the risk of being perceived as being aligned with one other side and what it means for you. And if you have received funding from the EU, every time you speak on the referendum, you need to talk about it. So interestingly, that guidance is actually leaked to the Telegraph before it's sent to charities. So it's leaked 3 days before. The Friday, the Telegraph gets it, calls the NGOs and charities to get back. And so by the time they actually receive the guidance, environmental charities are already front page of the Telegraph, something that the environment is rarely front page of the Telegraph. The environmental charities are going to manage to get it twice during the referendum, always being attacked. For the first time by using public funds, and the second time because they'll be in the pay of the EU. So what is interesting is, there's a big focus in the attacks on Friends of the Earth, Wildlife Trust, Greenpeace, as these kind of using public funds to fund for, to call for Remain. But actually at that time, the fact that these charities are really attacked is the time where actually, because we only know from end of February that the referendum is going to happen in June, it's a time where a lot of trustees were going to be meeting and discussing whether charities should get involved or not. And so there's been work now done, especially in the health sector, that actually that week and what happened then has been critical in making sure they didn't speak because they were too afraid of being taken to task as the environmental ones were. But the environmental ones had already started the process of getting engaged, and so they didn't pull out and they kind of kept going. Now, those that do decide to go for it and to campaign also then have to make do with the Gagging Act or the Lobbying Act of 2015 and the Electoral Commission. If you want to spend more than £10,000 during the campaign, you have to register and you have to pick a side. That means you have to say explicitly, I'm calling for Remain, I'm calling for Leave. Only four of the environmental groups do. Actually, only 3 charities at all across the UK do. Client Earth is actually the only charities that register, the only environmental charities that register under its charitable organization. E3G does, Friends of the Earth does, but through the trust, and Environmentalists for Europe is also there, which is kind of this pop-up movement that was created for the campaign and is actually under the umbrella of the European movement. Most of the groups I talked about earlier are not there. Most of the groups have chosen to speak on the environment during the campaign, but not to register fully, because that would be seen as too political. So what we're seeing is like the big groups, the RSPB, the Wildlife Trust, WWF, they decide to engage without actually campaigning fully for Remain. They're going to come up with a message that is like, Remain for nature. Like, I'm not telling you what to say, what to vote, but if you think about the environment, if you want to make this vote about the environment, then you should vote Remain. So a lot of caveats, but kind of calling for Remain, but from an environmental perspective. You do have a few groups, so ECG, Friends of the Earth, that do fully campaign for Remain, but even they are then facing additional issues with the way the electoral system works, which is basically it's very hard for them to work directly with the Remain campaign, because if they were to work directly with the Remain campaign, any costs of these kind of joint events would then be piled upon the many, many costs the Remain campaign has to deal with. And so there's the regulatory kind of obstacle to actually just working together and to kind of bring the environment front and center in the Remain campaign. So that you have then, in terms of to conclude with our external pressure, really a big media backlash. And that kind of feeds the conservative kind of streak in NGOs and charities, because they're so afraid of the amount of negative image they're going to get in the media, but also regulatory constraint. Quite a few of these were fined for what they did or didn't do during the 2015 general election in terms of campaigning. So they're being very careful, and so we're ending up with really kind of negotiating, but on the back foot. So what we have is really the idea of this anti-charity commission to a certain extent. Charities entered the referendum very wary, and they were actually right to do so. Most charities did not go for it, yet the environment did, which is what makes us turn then to our internal pressure to kind of understand how they managed to do it, even though almost all other charities didn't. The key thing here for me is the links to Europe. EU funding definitely mattered for all of these charities. So I don't know how familiar you are in the audience around EU funding for charities, but you basically have, if you've got a big charity in England that manages land, National Trust, Wildlife Trust, RSPB, if you can manage land, you can usually access some of the Common Agricultural Policy funding, and so you can get millions of pounds like this. If you do not, or in addition, if you have more like natural reserves, what you're going to get is more EU life funding, which is a kind of like specific on the environment and much smaller pot of money. But even then, the UK was really good. UK charities were really good at getting some of that money. Now, these are extremely rich charities in terms of the amount of money they have. So even though it looks like a lot, you know, millions of pounds a year, it's actually a tiny percentage of their earning. Now, for lots of the organizations that do not have that kind of massive land, actually the money they get from the EU is quite tiny. But that didn't, you know, that argument that actually, yes, I mean, we get a bit of money from Europe, that doesn't mean we are, you know, actually in the pay of Europe, did not land at all. And so on the campaign trail, those that did campaign were kept on being badgered about, of course, you're in the pay of the EU. Now, at the same time, they were quite ambivalent towards Europe at first, because, I mean, a lot of it was through ignorance of their staff, ignorance of the supporters as well, around, you know, the impact that Europe had on the environment. It's not something that a lot of like NGOs leaders that had been there for a long time knew about, but the younger staff didn't necessarily know about it. They had consciously made the decision to not, you know, while they were perhaps putting a few EU flags on EU funded projects, but they were not necessarily talking to the members for a long time about Europe because it was a touchy topic, and NGOs, like charities, don't like to be too political, so they were just like skirting around the topic. And in many ways, UK NGOs had led the fight against the Common Fisheries Policy, against the Common Agricultural Policy, against TTIP, you know, against a lot of key EU projects. And so they were very critical of Europe. Yet at this time, they had to say, okay, we may be critical of Europe and critical of a lot of things that comes at it. That doesn't mean we are anti-Europe. We want Europe to be actually better at this, but we actually think it still makes sense for us to stay in. So this was quite difficult for them to make that switch. And for a lot of their members that were actually looking at it was quite difficult. Nevertheless, they did. And so the other big obstacle for that was perhaps that membership. Now, membership can really be a blessing for campaigning because they have not a captive audience, but at least an audience that is ready to listen to them quite a lot. If we're talking about the RSPB, we're talking about 1.8 million member, Wildlife Trust around 800,000, Friends of the Earth 150,000. So these are relatively big groups, especially the RSPB. And so, you know, in terms of swinging votes, these were quite interesting people to look at. Now, that also meant the bigger the more members you have, the more likely it is that they're going to be diverse in terms of how they're going to feel about Brexit. And even organization like Greenpeace had like a pro-Leaver organization within their members. So it's not only the more conservative groups that had pro-Brexit members. But while Europe doesn't actually fund much of what they do, members do. And so being quite worried about angering member was really front and center to a lot of their thinking during the campaign. And so there was a lot of thinking about how to make sure that we get the information across to our members, but do not offend the members that support Leave too much. And so you've had some organizations that were, as a Wildlife Trust, so that's final quote here on that page, which was the campaign plan was really to reach out to members and to kind of tell them how, you know, local plans, like local trusts activities were going to be affected and how they were going to be affected, and to have something very tailored to the members' experience of the Wildlife Trust. Others actually felt that our members were, I mean, those members that they already are going to consider the environment when they're going to vote, so they already are going to consider Remain. So actually talking to them, I mean, it's nice, but we'd be preaching it converted. So that is, that was quite an issue. Now, in terms of, if you remember our internal pressure, we're also talking about how you have groups that are either local or like our international organization with a local presence in the UK. So from Greenpeace UK, Wildlife UK. And here what's quite interesting is actually 2 of the 6 groups we were looking at, those that did very little, so the CPRE that actually adopted a neutral stance, Greenpeace that spoke a bit and had CEO like doing a few op-eds, but basically stayed out of it. They're on the complete opposite side of that scale. The CPRE is England only. Greenpeace is one of the most kind of international organization there is. Interestingly, Greenpeace work on the referendum was actually after the referendum. A lot of this, getting the hand on the vote leave bus and repainting it and doing a lot of these kind of actions. But that was after the referendum, and during it did very little. Also because it didn't think that actually the people who were interested in hearing Greenpeace's view were likely to vote leave anyway. Now, the final explanation we had was around our internal structure. All charities we know have had to go through the same process of getting boards of trustees validating the position. That's something that the Charity Commission asks of them. Actually, some, like Friends of the Earth, had their ducks in a row since summer of 2015, and so got the board to sign off on the action twice, in the summer and in January. Some felt that members needed consulted and decided not to do it. And so CPRE said, let's not bother our members with it. We know they're not going to want to participate, so let's not do that. What's quite interesting is that we were expecting centralized organizations like the RSPB to be, and the WWF to be much quicker on the ball and much more likely to engage quite quickly. And yet the Wildlife Trust, out of these 3 big charities, was the one that moved quicker. And it goes against a lot of our thinking around, decentralized organization like Wildlife Trust, very tiny office, like there's 30 in the office compared to over 1,000 in the office centrally for RSPB. It's 47 trusts all across the UK, all across the 4 nations. And in the end, they managed to get, their position very clearly, in January, February, before even they published a big report with the WWF and RSPB. And they managed to do that in a way that kind of tells you, okay, how decentralized organizations work, which is that basically they said, it's okay if not all trusts campaign for Remain. We're going to produce material, each of the local trusts can use it or not. This is kind of the kind of we think you should be putting out, but you don't have to. So some trusts were very strongly campaigning for Remain, others did very little, and that was completely acceptable. And that's also what made it easier for them to move quickly. So in many ways, this goes against the idea of that kind of strong centralized group. But actually, I mean, these strong centralized groups of the RSPB, WWF, had to talk a lot with their trustees to get them to sign off on the idea that yes, it is dangerous, yes, but it really is worth it. So in the end, what we had is really this real shared external constraint that were mediated by these internal ones, leading to very, very divergent choices. Some CPRE abstained. Greenpeace, actually, most of it has been on free speech against the Gagging Act, still speaking out against other charities being called out for campaigning, much more than actually directly campaigning. WWF, RSPB, and Wildlife Trust were like Remain for nature, Remain for the environment. Friends of the Earth, E3G, were like actually calling for Remain, not just from an environmental perspective. In terms of the timing, some were prepared from the summer 2015. Quite a few of them decided actually early mid 2016. So for example, the RSPB had a holding position until basically RSPB and WWF called Remain for nature, really on the 1st of June. Between, all the they spent the first few months of June waiting for an official response from the campaign on what they were going to do on the environment. It's only when they responded, they got response, when they got to have David Cameron come to an RSPB reserve, that they decided, okay, we come off the fence. So the focus was very much, most of these actually only spoke about the environment, and they only felt comfortable doing so. E3G is really one of the odd one out there, where they actually talked about international collaboration more and a kind of broader and youth movement and all that. But most of them were really felt extremely constrained by the charitable aims that they have to really stick to the environment with a capital E, and that made it difficult. And in terms of targets, they tried to do a bit of all of this and actually kind of failed at reaching all of these different targets at the same time. Now, very quickly, the lessons. Hopefully, I'm quite actually interested in hearing as well from this presentation whether you think there's other lessons we can learn. But these are the lessons I've highlighted already, I've identified already. So first, back to our assumptions, we know that yes, the regulatory barriers are critical to understand this, and actually they were sufficient to prevent most charities from speaking out. Yet, environmental NGOs did go for it, most of it, especially those that had strong link with Europe. So both Greenpeace and CPRE. Greenpeace has Greenpeace Europe, but there's very few links between Greenpeace UK and Greenpeace Europe, and CPRE had stopped engaging with Europe directly. Even those that did go, the regulatory barriers really constrained what they could do, especially having to stick to talking about the environment, having to stick to doing things independently from the official Remain campaign. The timing made it extremely awkward. These are NGOs, I mean, some of them have a lot of money, some of them don't, but in any case, they've got a clear plan of how they're going to be spending that money. And the fact that there was a very quick acceleration of the timing of the referendum mean that instead of 2017 funding, it had to be then taken from 2016 funding, which was really unexpected. But the key thing is that the fear of angering members and the fear of getting kind of bad backlash from the media was really driving a lot of these choices. And actually, it was really unfunded. They didn't lose members. Their members stuck by them. And actually they gained members in some cases. So in many ways, they could have potentially been more courageous, and they just didn't trust in themselves enough. Now, so what does it mean? I think in terms of speaking about Europe from an environmental perspective, and that's going to be something that happens in any kind of debate on Europe in any member state. It's actually really difficult selling that lack of control that we need. One of the good things about Europe acting on the environment is that it constrains member states to not, every time you've got a new government, to chop environmental standards and to get quick wins like this. And so you basically say, it's really good that our government has less power. In a campaign that was dominated by taking back control, it really was not flying well. So what you could do is you could sell success. It's actually Europe is not imposing things. It's actually the UK as driving Europe that is imposing things on the other Europeans. You don't like the Europeans, but we're telling them what to do because we're so good at this. And that was not made at all. That was a choice by the Remain campaign to really talk more about, Europe is not great, but it will cost so much, instead of Europe is not great, but actually a lot of these things, it's down to us. That didn't work well. In many ways, it was very easy for the Leave campaign to say, well, of course, Europe's done great things about the environment, but we're not going to remove that. We're going to keep the good and get rid of the bad. And because a lot of it was very high level, just slogans, it was actually very easy for the Leave campaign to get away with that and not have to specify and to perhaps present different version of what the good is, what the bad is to different audiences. In many ways, though, the environmental groups were also constrained by they were afraid the cap was going to be thrown at them as well. You saw it say about Europe is good for the environment, but what about the common agricultural policy? That risk did not materialize, but it could in other contexts. So in terms of campaigning, one of the big issues they did is that because they were so expert-based and so nuanced, they kind of decided more, it's better for us to go and talk to Radio 4 2-day program than Good Morning Britain. And so they were really trying to influence the kind of leaders instead of powerless people. And in a referendum, that doesn't work. You need to get your message across to normal people as well, and not just a Westminster bubble. And that's something that NGOs have been really struggling with. They got so good at, navigating the circles of power that they were, really struggling to shift. And so in the end, they were as bad as general UK commentators on Europe. from a Remain or Eurofied perspective, are always having lots of nuance, always having lots of caveats, not being able to just say something pro-European without coming with a lot of footnotes. And that is also, I mean, that's a general problem. And I think one thing that they kept on pointing at is that a lot of this could not be just done, like changed during the campaign. Groundwork was needed decades ahead, fostering a different narrative on Europe across the country. And I've been way too long, but if you want to find out more about Brexit and the environment, this is our website, this is our Twitter handle, and thank you very much.
So I think I'm going to now be handing over to Dr. Catherine Simpson from Manchester Metropolitan University and fellow Deputy Director of the Manchester Jean Monnet Centre. Over to you, Catherine.
Thanks, Paul. First of all, Viviane, thank you so much for a really, really interesting presentation. I'd like to commend you on the use of images as well. I loved the really good photographs of throughout. It was really nice to see that. I have a couple of questions I'm going to kind of jump in, and then I'll collate from the audience and maybe also bring Paul in. And I suppose I have three questions, and they're relatively broad. But my first one is, do you think the environmental lobby is strong enough or powerful enough in the UK to play a role in the EU referendum? Do you think it was, was it actually worth kind of, giving a voice to, number one? And did it have confidence in itself to play a voice? So that's the first question. The second question I want to ask you is the narrative around climate and environmental economics and politics. Do you think it's a lot more visible now than it was in 2016? Have we seen a bit of a step change in environmental issues since 2016 even to now? Are they more present? Are they more visible? Certainly in kind of the public domain. And my kind of third thing then, coming into what you talked about at the very end, which I thought was very interesting about the lobby speaking to BBC Radio 4 as opposed to Good Morning Britain. Are environmental issues, and again, politics, policy, seen as kind of a middle class issue? And then as a consequence, feeding in almost indirectly to that narrative of the EU's an elitist project, and again, kind of giving that distance. So they're my three questions I'd like to ask you now.
So if you look at member figures, there's more members in the EU, but in UK environmental NGOs than any of the UK parties put together. So Greener UK is a coalition of NGOs that has been created after the referendum to respond to the need, talks about having 8 million members across the UK. So it's a massive group. The RSPB in itself is just 1.2 million members, or 1.8 million members. National Trust is incredible. National Trust, people don't necessarily think of it as environmental NGO, but it is. It manages a lot of land and does that from definitely a very strong environmental perspective. So these were, they're silent groups for a lot of that, but they're huge silent group. So if you talk about the silent majority and all of these kind of things, these are, and it's quite interesting. I mean, Team Bale did research on what party members are also members of, and shows that I think 39% of Lib Dem members are also National Trust members, for example, but actually the RSPB is kind of more split. You've got around 10% Labour members with 5% Lib Dem or 5% Conservative. So it cuts across a lot of these members, lots of these parties. So they were strong. A lot of them were actually really strong, and they're some of the bigger charities. They're not like, some of the health or development charity like Oxfam and that will be also very big, but they're quite big. And they also are, because of the value of the environment, I mean, a lot of it is they're quite decentralized in, perhaps not in their structure, but you've got, RSPB reserves all around the world, like all around the UK, same with the Wildlife Trust. So they're not seen necessarily as London metropolitan kind of thing. They're also kind of local people, being just volunteers in their local places. Now, they weren't, whether they were confident enough or not, I think, in many ways they weren't. And in some ways they were too confident. So quite a few were, most around the environmental NGOs were pretty confident it was going to be a Remain vote. And that also kind of held back a lot of it. So like, are we really going to risk this? Risk angering members, risk angering regulators for something that is obviously going to go for Remain. So I think, we've seen that in academia, we've seen that in so many other fields, that there's been kind of a crisis after the referendum of like, oh, we could have done more. But in many ways, the environmental NGOs did do way more than all of the others. So I think that crisis is a bit less warranted for them. But the fact that in many ways, it's very hard to do something quite like completely radically different from what you've done before. And for them, in the UK especially, they built really strong relationship with ministers and with MPs of different parties. So they were really good at influencing the circle of power, influencing Westminster. But it's a very different type of tool than influencing actually, people on the street. And so I think that was more that kind of change, completely rethinking the way to communicate. That was really hard to do on the fly, especially because of that compressed timing of the referendum. Now, in terms of the EU elitist project, I think in many ways it was difficult. I think, the environmental movement is struggling with this, as always struggled with this. I think in many ways it is unfair because most of the first victims of environmental harm are definitely not rich people. And you have a lot of, grassroots environmental movements. But at the same time, we're seeing like lots of criticisms around Extinction Rebellion strategy of having people arrested, which does not necessarily make themselves very popular with BAME Britons that don't want to get arrested and know that if they were getting arrested, it might be really bad for them. So I think this is a general problem for the environmental movement, but I don't think it was really picked upon that much. That's not why people were angry against them. It was more of it's not so much you're an elitist, it's that you're in the pay of the EU. We can't trust you because you've sold your soul to the EU more than because you're elite. That kind of is clear enough. I think that's three. It's a three, it's a three questions.
But three. I think you're. I think it's really interesting. To talk about how big their membership base is. Is absolutely astounding. I would have known they were big, but I wouldn't have anticipated those organisations to be as big. And I think the research around how their membership maps onto different political parties as well is fascinating. And in some respect, I think it's. In hindsight, probably a missed opportunity. But hindsight's a great thing, and as you say, there's plenty of examples of people who are having those kind of internal but also external kind of conversations and conflict with themselves about what could have been done during the referendum period. I also think as well, and this is kind of a follow-up question, and I'll pass over to Paul. Do you think as well the makeup of Charity Commission, the policy around how they operate, and in particular the Electoral Commission's influence in that and the restrictions, do you think that was probably one of the key roles of why they were so reluctant to get involved as well?
Well, yeah, so I didn't go too much in detail here, but one of the members of the Charity Commission was a prominent Leaver and was doing op-eds for Leave. So it was something they were really worried about. The RSPB had been attacked in front of the Charity Commission by the Countryside Alliance and by a grouse shooting industry sponsored, You Forgot the Bird, the year before, and they'd won both of these cases, but they were quite, and Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace both got fined by the Electoral Commission for their action during the 2015 campaign. So they were, it was not a fantasy. They knew there was clear regulatory risks. And I think in many ways, perhaps more, the fact that they also knew the risks and knew that they were real, but also not completely insurmountable, meant that they were perhaps more courageous than charities in other sector. And I think that's just one thing I'd like to say, that, they tried to work together and to a certain extent failed, but actually the fact that they'd thought so much about the referendum meant that they were ready to roll with Greener UK after the referendum directly. And so the environmental NGOs and charities have had much more influence on on Brexit since than any other environmental sector. And we're only getting a replacement for the Commission and the Court of Justice in the environmental sector, even though these were not environmental regulators. So they've done an incredible job after, like on Brexit, even though they failed on the referendum. And the fact that they failed on the referendum also brought them together for Brexit.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Viviane. I'm going to hand over to Paul and I'm going to collate some questions from our audience. So again, if you've got any questions or queries, please put them in the Q&A and we can field them to Dr. Gravey.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Viviane. I've got a couple of questions that kindly have been sent over from Konstantinos, who manages everything behind the scenes, and they're really great questions. So I thought I'd ask those as well as one of my own. So Konstantinos asked whether you believe that the Remain campaign, had it actually prioritised environmental issues and climate change, would it actually have made a difference to the outcome? So the argument you've been making is that they didn't do as much as they could, but had they done, do you think that would have actually tipped the balance? Another question that I'd like to ask is, we've talked about, so I wasn't in the UK, ironically. There's a cliche of European politics people. I was in Germany for 2 months before the referendum, so I don't know what the atmosphere was like. How influential were the NGOs beyond, say, the main campaign? So I know the Vote Leave and Leave.eu, two different, well, one was official, one wasn't, and then there was an official Remain campaign. Were there effective NGOs that were pushing for Brexit, and could we say that, or was it really down to those kind of Remain campaigns? And then the final question, which I think is one that a lot of people here will be wondering, which Konstantinos asked. So, sorry, Viviane, I'm asking you these big questions in groups of three. To what extent has Brexit led to backsliding with environmental performance in the UK? So I know this is a slightly different paper, different project, and it's a very big question, but both Konstantinos and I would love to hear a little bit more about that.
I forgot the first one, so I'm going to start with the second one and third, and then you tell me again the first one. So basically, oh yeah, no, it was on Remain, the first one. Okay, so I think there is in an extremely predictable way, the Remain campaign was all about cost-benefit analysis. It was a super soft Eurosceptic campaign. It was all about, I mean, it's not great, but it would be worse outside. It was nothing so selling around, you know, it's actually great to work with your neighbors. And not only that, but we're actually really good at it. We've been leading in Europe. That means that, you know, we are, I mean, I guess, you know, I'm French. So for me, the whole idea that, you know, through Europe, France can have more influence over its neighbors, but in a, you know, pacifist way, is something obvious. And yet it was completely absent from a lot of the Remain side. I mean, Gordon Brown did try to kind of make that claim around climate as well, but it was basically absent. And the idea that the UK kept on presenting itself as something outside of Europe and not really, you know, one of the big driving force of Europe. And so, and on the environment, it actually had, you know, so climate in this sense was like an obvious example of, you know, the UK climate leader has managed to make sure that it doesn't lead on its own and shares the cost with all of Europe. And actually, you know, so perhaps, you know, I'm not sure how much saying, you know, thanks to Europe, you can go to Blackpool and there's no shit in the water, which is what a lot of the NGOs did. Would that, you know, coming from the Remain campaign, I'm not sure that would have necessarily worked because it's a lot about Europe forced us to clean up our act. But you could have a really positive take on actually Europe allows us to, you know, to have more influence. You know, the only way you get a global Britain is if you get a European Britain first. And that's the kind of thing that I think would have, you know, Europe, the environment could have definitely played a role there. In terms of Vote Leave, you had few vote people from the environmental movement openly talking about leaving. You had a few members of the Green Party, so one of the Green, member of the House of Lords right now. You had, but I mean, for example, responding officially to the RSPB on the environmental report was George Eustice, so the farming minister then, who was talking about how, you know, spirit crushing the Habitats and Nature, Habitats and Birds Directive, which are basically, you know, at the center of what the RSPB and wildlife trusts like about Europe, should get rid of. So that was not necessarily a strong pro-environment. They were not talking about the environment. They were only saying, you know, the environment, we're going to keep the good, and in any case, you can't trust these guys because they're paid by Brussels. Now, in terms of backsliding, Yes and no. So as in I think the UK still, it's going to depend environmental issue by environmental issue, because I mean, I have not yet looked in detail at the net zero plan that has been announced today or yesterday. So I think on climate, the UK is still doing pretty good. I think it's made people realize that the environment is devolved. So actually, if we talk about backsliding, we need to look at what's happening in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland as well. Especially because they're not bound by common EU rules anymore. What we do see, though, is in terms of governance, you're going to have weaker governance structure. And we've seen that, for example, I mean, the environmental movements had convinced the Lords to support a stronger environmental bill, but we're now at the ping pong stage of the environmental bill, and it looks like the government is not going to support most of these amendments. So we are going for a pretty, I mean, much better than what was expected in 2016, but still backsliding compared to EU standards and EU governance structure on the environment. So it's it's a weird thing, because they've won a lot of victories, environmental movement and scientists and all that. But it's just like the baseline was, we don't need an environmental regulator, we can be Singapore on Thames kind of thing. So just by, they won a lot, and they put a lot of effort to basically stand still or be actually a bit below than what they were within the EU.
Well, we'd like to normally finish around 10:02, because that means people can carry on to the 3 o'clock meetings if they have them. So we do have the briefest of windows if there was an emergency question. But otherwise, if not, Catherine, shall I start to wrap up? Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah. Viviane, I'd just like to thank you so much for joining us today, and hopefully in the very near future we'll welcome you to Manchester and take you out for a nice lunch and a good cup of coffee. But it's been a really interesting talk today, and a kind of a new approach that I'm not so familiar with in terms of my research. So thank you very much for coming.
Brilliant. And just to flag, as Konstantinos has done there, our next seminar is on the German election, which for those of you who take my second year comparative West European politics module, this will be a seminar of great interest with Dr. Henry Vogt. But for now, Dr. Viviane Gravey, it has been such a pleasure to get to hear the latest research on this topic. Thank you so much for joining us at the Manchester Jean Monnet Centre.
It was a pleasure.
And if you may pop back, if that's okay, on the same threads, then we'll just do a quick interview as well. Everyone else, thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Konstantinos, for organising it. From Dr. Simpson and myself, thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.